Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Rock and Walk Talk podcast. I'm Alan, and we're in week 3 of Advent. And this week, we light what? We light the joy candle. And right out of the gate, I want to talk about joy because for a lot of people, joy can be a tricky one, because a lot of us will hear the word joy and immediately think, well, you know, joy is great for people whose lives are going well. And maybe for you, life is tough right now. There's a lot of things that are going on. We've got bills to pay and we've got health issues and relationship problems and the world's crazy. And for a lot of people, that joy is hard to find. But let's talk about Advent joy, right? Biblical joy. And that's a whole different thing, right? And so I want to talk about the difference between I want to talk about joy is not the same as happiness. And we're going to clear that up. So let's talk about how the difference between joy and happiness. With happiness is an emotional thing. It's circumstantial, right? It's tied into like what's happening to you in real time. What's happening to me right now depends on my happiness. But joy is spiritual and it's foundational. It's tied to who God is, regardless of what is happening around us. Happiness says things are good right now, right? But joy says God is good even right now, even when things are a mess. And Advent joy shows up in some really, we'll say, like unexpected places. Like we can find joy in the middle of our mess. And since we're in the Christmas season, if you read the Christmas story closely, we're going to notice something that's interesting. Nobody's life is neat and tidy. When we read about the Christmas story, Mary is young. She's confused. She's carrying a miracle inside of her, that back then could have ruined her reputation. Joseph is wrestling with, he's wrestling with doubt, fear, and responsibility, a responsibility he never asked for, and then you have, Elizabeth, right? Elizabeth waited for decades for a promise, and thought it would never come. Zechariah, he questioned God, and what happened to him? He literally lost his voice, And then, the rest of the people in the Christmas story, we have the shepherds. The shepherds were men, working a night shift, and yet joy kept breaking into the story. And it wasn't because, life was easy, right? It's because what? Because God was present. God was present in their struggles, Advent joy doesn't like wait for things to improve. It shows up, while things are still unresolved. And I want to talk about Mary's joy. Mary's joy was wrapped around what? It was wrapped around surrender. Mary surrendered. It was surrender before certainty, So when we talk about Mary from a human perspective, in those times, it wasn't a joyful situation, that people would perceive on her, And the thing is, Mary didn't have like a 5-year plan, She didn't know how Joseph would react to this news. She didn't know how this would affect her, her family, or her future. And yet she finds joy in the moment. Because what does Mary say? Mary says, "My soul magnifies the Lord." And when we think about that, my soul magnifies the Lord in this circumstance. That's not denial of the circumstance. That's complete surrender. Mary's joy didn't come from knowing how everything would work out for her. Her joy came from trust, from trusting who God is. And her not knowing all the details. God knew all the details. And that's important for us, because some of us are some of us are waiting for clarity, before we even choose joy, But as we study Advent, Advent teaches us that joy comes before clarity of the situation, right? Joy says, God, I don't understand this, but I trust you. And what is that? That's that peace that surpasses all understanding. Man, it's so important to me, you know. But joy, it's joy that comes after waiting, you know. And there's something to be learned in that. There's something to be learned from Elizabeth and Zachariah. The two of them waited a very long time. For a child, they waited years and decades. And I'm sure that their prayers felt like they hit a wall, they hit a ceiling, and it all fell back down on them. And Elizabeth's joy was quiet. It was grateful. It was full of gratitude. But then you have on the other side, Zechariah's joy is so strong that when his voice finally returned, what did he do? He explodes into praise, right? So what's the lesson in that? Well, sometimes our joy is delayed. Strength will rise as we wait upon the Lord, right? But it's never forgotten by God. And if you have been waiting for a long time for something, and it could be healing, direction in your life, restoration of a relationship, or just peace that you're longing for. Advent joy reminds us that waiting seasons are not wasted seasons. Joy is a choice. It's not a mood. And this is where joy gets uncomfortable, because joy is not automatic. Joy is a choice that we make. Joy is a choice that we make in response to God's faithfulness. So what does that mean? It doesn't mean that you ignore pain, or that that you fake smiles, or you pretend everything's okay. It means that we should say, even here in the mess of things, or whatever is, causing us anxiety, whatever, that God is still good in my struggles. Joy doesn't deny the reality of the situation. Joy declares, that there's a deeper reality, And even, we talked about Elizabeth, Zechariah. We'll talk about the shepherds. The shepherds find joy in the ordinary. The shepherds weren't powerful. They weren't influential men, and they weren't expecting anything extraordinary. They were doing their jobs, and that's when joy broke in. And you think about the angels. The angels didn't appear in some great palace. They appeared in a field. And for us, joy often shows up like that in ordinary places. Joy can show up at work, in our car, or on a walk, or, in our quiet coffee times like I like to have in the mornings. And then, you realize suddenly, God has been carrying us all along. And that's what Advent joy reminds us, that God meets us where we are, not where we think we should be, and so I'm throwing a few words, watching, waiting, walking, and wondering, right? Advent is a journey. When we think about Advent, we watch for God, even when it's dark. We wait for God even when times are hard, and we walk with God even when the path isn't clear. But yet, what is he? He's a lamp unto our feet, right? And I hope and pray that we wonder at God, even when we don't understand, that we still have this awe and wonder of God. Joy often lives in the wondering, right? Wonder says, I don't have all the answers, but I know who does. God has the answers, and he carries us, And I'm going to say this too, joy, this is kind of maybe weird to say, but joy is a weapon, right? We can use it as a weapon. And here's And we don't talk about it enough, but what joy fights back for us, joy pushes against despair. Joy confuses the enemy. Joy weakens fear. You know, so when we choose joy, we're not ignoring like the hardship of our lives, right? We're just declaring that hardship doesn't get the final word in what's happening in the moment. Or we can put it this way, joy says this situation's heavy, but we serve a God who is heavier than that. Joy is rooted in promise. Let's think about what Isaiah said. Isaiah said what? The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. What does light do? Light brings joy. Jesus didn't just bring joy. He is joy. He is the light of the world. Light brings joy. Because where Jesus is present, joy becomes possible. Right? Not perfect joy, not constant joy, but anchored joy, anchored to Jesus, right? So what does joy look like for us today? Like, how can we reimagine joy for us today? Well, joy could look like this, worshiping when we don't feel like it, gratitude in the middle of a very frustrating time, trust when we don't have all the answers, when they haven't come yet, or peace, when the circumstances, don't match up, or smiling because life isn't easy all the time, but we smile because what? God is faithful, Joy is not a shouting loud happiness, Joy is a quiet strength, Advent joy can be forward looking, And Advent joy isn't just about remembering what God did, it's about trusting what God is doing and anticipating what God will do and continue to do. And here's 3 things we can be joyful about. Christ came, Christ comes, and Christ will come again, And joy lives in that, between the promise and fulfillment, So I want to thank you for hanging out today on the Rock and Walk Talk on the 3rd week of Advent, joy. So if you're listening today and if you don't feel joyful, I'm just going to clearly say this to you. You're not failing. Joy is not a feeling that you manufacture. Joy is a truth that you can lean into. And, Advent joy says this: God is with me. God is faithful. God is not finished yet, And for us, that's enough. Even now, that's enough. So again, I want to thank you. And in next week, we're going to close the Advent series with the final series, and it's going to be love. The kind of love that didn't stay in heaven, but stepped into a manger. So my friends, until then, I pray that you keep walking, keep trusting, keep rocking, and let joy fight for you. And I'll see you next time right here on the Rock and Walk Talk. Peace to you all. Peace. This is a rock and walk.